Hi, everyone, and welcome to this live lesson, part of the virtual Ocean Pavilion everyone, at COP30. It's also part of the Convex Seascape Survey education program. And today, what we're going to be talking about and learning about is what has the ocean got to do with climate. And to help us answer this very, very important question, it's my great pleasure to welcome Tom to this live lesson. Hi, Tom.
Hi, Jamie.
Could you just introduce yourself quickly to those in the Virtual Ocean Pavilion and those in classes watching?
Yeah, absolutely. With pleasure. Well, it's great to be here. My name is Tom Rodand. I'm a senior lecturer of physical geography at the University of Exeter. And I'm working on the Convex Seascape Survey. I have a slight confession to make in that by training, I'm actually a terrestrial ecosystem scientist. And it's the Convex Seascape Survey that's allowed me to really learn a lot more about the oceans. So in many ways, I am going to be learning with our students today. And if there's any educators in the crowd, what I'm doing in pedagogical terms is modeling scholarship by, like I said, learning alongside the students.
Brilliant. Tom, thanks so much. So we've got this lesson for classes watching. This is also part of the Virtual Ocean Pavilion, as I mentioned, for those professional scientists and those working in this area. What we hope you get from this live lesson is an overview of what some of the learning choices we have for bringing this to young people, what some of the things that they may not know. So just follow along, and we hope you'll enjoy the ride. Just before we start, we've got a shout out to Tring School and Year 8 who are studying global issues. Hi to all the students there. We've got schools from India, Canada, Austria, Poland, and the UK joining. So really massive welcome to all of you. Tom, can we get started? We've talked about the Convex Seascape Survey a couple of times. Can we just get started with what that is, and then we'll get into the live lesson itself?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Convex Seascape Survey is a huge 5-year international project that focuses on bringing ocean experts together from around the world to answer some really crucial questions around the role of coastal ecosystems and continental shelf habitats in the global carbon cycle. My particular contribution in this project is to look at how much carbon exists in continental shelf sediments, where it came from, and how quickly it accumulated.
Brilliant. Thank you. We're gonna start off with some hopefully simple science that everybody should know, and then we're going to expand it. We're going to start off by talking about the ocean and the carbon cycle. I know we have a range of age groups here. It's something that's on most curricula across the world, but very often it's limited to what we can see, Tom, in this first slide. Well, these terrestrial processes. Can you just give those watching a bit of an update on what we can see in this slide?
Yeah, so I think most people are fairly familiar with the concept of the terrestrial carbon cycle. This idea that plants photosynthesize, they take in CO2 from the air. Some of that ends up in soils, and if it's there for a long time, it turns into fossil fuels and so on and so forth. But the ocean actually has its own version, its own component of this global carbon cycle. And actually, many of the processes here are quite similar to the ones that we understand in terrestrial systems. So instead of plants, we have things like phytoplankton. We also have seaweed and seagrass and other marine vegetation, which again also photosynthesize. They take in CO2 from the water. Some of that material makes its way down to the bottom, the seafloor, and is stored. Other elements are then re-released back to the atmosphere. But for all intents and purposes, the actual the processes involved are quite similar to the terrestrial carbon cycle. So if we understand one in basic terms, we have a good chance of understanding the other one too. There are also other processes associated with the marine or the ocean carbon cycle that it would be good to go into a bit more detail on. Okay, so the first obviously is this process of sedimentation, and it's not a million miles away from the process of soil formation on land. Okay, so those phytoplankton or those other forms of marine flora and fauna, so plants and animals, they live in the ocean, they die, Sometimes they're eaten, sometimes they're recycled in terms of their carbon and their nutrients and that sort of stuff. But some of it, the remainder, settles on the seafloor. That carbon that's contained within that living organic material gets locked up in muds and sands, and that's, in basic terms, that process of sedimentation. If conditions are right, that carbon can stay locked up in those sediments for thousands, if not millions of years, which is what makes them such an important part of the global carbon cycle. We also then have circulation to consider. Okay, oceans are huge, they're incredibly complex, and we have two different types of circulation that are interesting to us in this context. So first off, we have vertical mixing. Okay, so you'll all be really familiar with the concepts of winds and tides and waves and temperature changes that can occur in the world's oceans. And what these processes combine, what these processes do when they come with this idea of the ocean conveyor belt, okay, the thermohaline we sometimes call it, or the bit that affects us in the British Isles is the Gulf Stream, possibly as it's sometimes known. Okay, and this global circulation is responsible for moving water and carbon and nutrients and everything else that exists within water around the world. It moves, in general terms, it moves warm water from the tropics up to the poles where that water sinks, it cools and it sinks and potentially can contribute to bringing carbon down into those deep waters in colder environments, and it can stay there for, again, sometimes thousands of years. Much like the terrestrial system, we also have this process of interaction, if you like, between the ocean and the atmosphere. So on land, we're used to talking about things like photosynthesis and respiration and how that facilitates an exchange between the ocean and the atmosphere. Basically, the same process happens in oceans as well. Okay, so when we have abundant, for example, phytoplankton, so these phytoplankton are small microscopic ocean plants. They can draw out CO2 from the water and therefore from the atmosphere. They can lock that up and help the ocean become a sink of carbon in that context. But also, when they die and they decay, they release that carbon quite often in surface waters, and that can be released into the atmosphere. Or when they die and decay, they actually fall to the seabed, as we talked about, that process of sedimentation, and get locked up in the sediments on the seafloor as well. And then finally, I think it's really important not to consider the terrestrial carbon cycle and the oceanic carbon cycle as separate. Okay, they're very much connected. And runoff, as the diagram shows here, is one really good example of how these interactions between the terrestrial and the marine carbon cycle can take place. So obviously on land, we have carbon being absorbed by things like plants and animals. That then can enter the soils, it can enter rivers, it can enter groundwater and make its way through those processes into the oceans. Once it reaches the oceans, it can be used by marine life to survive, to feed on and all that sort of stuff. Or again, it can sink to the seafloor and get locked up. So that's one of the reasons why actually we need to think, when we're trying to protect our oceans, we also need to think about protecting our terrestrial ecosystems too, because they're all interconnected.
Brilliant. Tom, what an amazing run through the ocean carbon cycle and beyond. A couple of things that struck me, which maybe you can share. I think the first of all is how can we understand climate through this diagram that we've now climate change that we through this diagram we've now got on screen.
Yeah, so I think the one of the key things in the climate change discussion is the bit on the far left there, this human activity that is essentially releasing huge amounts of greenhouse gas into the Earth's atmosphere. And that's one of the key components of the global carbon cycle that has changed in recent decades and centuries. And it's become such an important element of the cycle for us as we learn more about the impacts, past, present, and future of climate change. So really, for me, it's about those emissions that are coming from the factories and the cars that we can see over on the far side there, and thinking about how all of the elements of the carbon cycle further to the right, so the vegetation, the forests, the oceans, the continental shelf habitats, can help us in mitigating against those anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions.
And I think this is the last one before we move on to the next question is, how important do you think it is that we have this very joined up picture of the Earth system, where we don't just look at one thing in isolation, but we try and join everything up?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's vital. I think the more that we learn about how the Earth system operates, how it interacts, the more important it becomes for us to understand that everything is essentially linked, and change in one element of the Earth system or in the carbon cycle can have knock-on effects. So we really can't alter one element or preserve or protect one element without thinking about preserving and protecting other elements too. It's all absolutely interlinked.
Tom, thank you so much for that wonderful overview of the carbon cycle. You've talked through some of these sort of, stores, atmosphere, vegetation, soil, sediment. I think we're going to go on to the next section is to understand not just the idea of a process, but the sort of the numbers behind this or the levels behind this. And so, where is all the carbon? We've got a quick poll. I think the first poll for Tom, and you can take classes and other viewers through the carbon ranking poll, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. So we can see in front of us a series of boxes of different sizes. Now, these all represent different carbon stores on Earth. Okay, so different parts of our global carbon cycle. And what we're asking you to do is try and work out which of these different boxes, which of course are different sizes, and the different sizes relate to how much carbon is locked up in each component. Try and work out what each one of those boxes actually represents, whether it's atmosphere, fossil fuels, the ocean, soil and sediment, or vegetation. Now, important to add that those answers there are listed in alphabetical order, so no clues are being given away here.
And the poll box is just to the side of the main viewer, so it's where the Q&A is. We've just pressed play on that, so the poll will be showing. Do drop us a message if that's not. But I think you've got a minute to try and get these in order from the biggest. So drag the biggest one to the top, and then the smallest at the bottom, and we'll see how you get on in just a minute's time. So you've been doing amazing stuff, Tom. I'm just going to give you some of the results coming through. We've got ocean coming up top, then atmosphere, then soil and sediment, fossil fuels, and then lastly vegetation. Should we share the answers?
Please do.
Okay, brilliant. I think we've got those coming up on screen now with the colours for each of the slides, and take us through, Tom, some of the things that maybe might surprise people watching.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it sounds like people have been doing their research really nicely and paying attention in class, because it sounds like the order of those was nearly spot on. So I think there's a common misconception that it's the world's forests that are the biggest carbon stores on Earth. But as we can see, looking at these answers, the reality is actually that the oceans are by far the biggest carbon stores on Earth. And in oceans, carbon can be stored in the seawater itself, as we know, but it can also be stored at the bottom of the ocean in the sediments that settle on the seabed. Those sort of terrestrial soils and sediments, things like peatlands, are incredibly important, but again dwarfed by the role played, the store provided by the world's oceans. The atmosphere and vegetation are smaller components again, but these are very active parts of the system. That's where all that carbon exchange largely is taking place. But I think one of the really interesting things here is that the real heavyweights, if you like, of the carbon storage world are actually largely not well. They're not particularly visible. They're hidden underwater, or they're hidden underground in the form of oceans and soils and sediments. Okay. And it's just really important, I guess, to take from this that we need to be protecting some of those stores. It's not all about protecting rainforest, as important as that is. We need to actually protect mud. And ironically, it's not particularly glamorous to call for campaigns that save the mud. It's rather easier to get people excited about rainforests. But hopefully, this figure here and the results of this poll that you've all done really highlight the importance of mud as well.
And just to give a sense of how those stores have changed over time, and we've got some figures from a pre-industrial level to sort of I think the last sort of five to 10 years in terms of the science used for these estimates. What are some of the big changes here that you would like to highlight for classes?
Yeah, absolutely. I think
yeah.
yeah, thanks, Jamie. I think the big story here is the depletion of fossil fuels. Okay, so on the left-hand side there, we can see the size of these different carbon stores in pre-industrial times, and then where they're at right now. And we can see like I say, one of the big stories is the fact that that fossil fuels store has got dramatically smaller. Equally, the carbon store provided by the Earth's atmosphere has increased considerably as well. Everything else has stayed relatively comparable. So the big story there for me is really this interchange between the atmosphere and the fossil fuels. It's worth noting that the ocean numbers have increased slightly there, and that's because the oceans are taking up some of this, in inverted commas, extra carbon that's being released by human activity. So I think the last estimate suggested that the oceans take up about 30% of CO2 from human activity, greenhouse gas emissions. Vegetation, you'll notice, has fallen slightly, most likely linked to obviously to deforestation and forest clearance and that sort of stuff. But yeah, the big changes really are happening on land and in the atmosphere, and the oceans are, continuing to quietly do their thing and soaking up as much carbon as they are able to.
So, Tom, what we haven't quite touched on is, we're going into this next section here. Is that we've looked at the processes, we've looked at the sizes and the change in the stores, but why does this matter?
Mm.
And this next section, why does this matter for the ocean? How is warming, and we haven't included in here the mechanism by which excess carbon dioxide and other gases in the atmosphere are driving increases in global temperatures. I think for this lesson we'll take that as read rather than get into it. But this next section sort of looks at the impact on the ocean, and there's some quite surprising sort of facts that are sort of around this.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think for many of us, when we think of climate change, our minds automatically turn to the atmosphere. Okay, and we think about increasing temperatures. We think about the changes in weather patterns and in rainfall, precipitation, and storminess, and all of the things that are affected by that, like flash flooding and wildfire and droughts and so on and so forth. And too often, probably, we're guilty of not considering how climate change and particularly global warming is affecting the ocean and the life that it contains. Now, the reality is that 90% of the heat associated with global warming has actually been absorbed by the world's oceans. And to think about how we can equate these numbers and imagine these numbers, it's the equivalent to something like 5 atomic bombs worth of energy being absorbed by the ocean every second for the last 25 years. It's a phenomenal amount of energy and a phenomenal amount of heat that has been taken up by the world's oceans. We've also seen an increase in the frequency and intensity of what we call marine heat waves, which are exactly the same as terrestrial heat waves, short bursts of heat that can obviously affect vulnerable marine life as well. So ultimately, the oceans are doing quite a lot to protect the land from heat already, but it does obviously come at a cost. So there are a series of well-documented impacts that climate change is having on the world's oceans, and we'll just run through each of them quite quickly, if that's all right, Jamie.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we've got we've got sea level. Okay, so sea levels are rising for two reasons really. One is because warm water actually expands and therefore raises sea levels as a result of that, so thermal expansion. But also because in a warming world, ice in particularly in polar regions, obviously, is melting and finding its way to the ocean and raising sea level for that reason as well. And the likelihood is that we're looking at sea level rise of something like 2 meters by the end of the century. Beyond that, the numbers get even bigger, but we won't get into that today. Coral reefs, again, another very charismatic, iconic ocean system are suffering at the hands of climate change and the impacts that are being felt by the ocean. So corals are extremely vulnerable, and they tend to form, or they only form in very specific areas because they have a very specific temperature window in which they can form and grow. And the problem is that the world's oceans are warming. It's creating a situation where the algae that those corals rely upon um, is actually failing to interact with the corals, actually dying off, and as a result, we're starting to see these beautiful, iconic coral reefs bleaching. Okay, so turning white and ultimately dying. And there's great concern that these fantastic biodiverse ecosystems that we enjoy so much might well be one of the first to be lost to climate change. Um, Sea ice, okay, so unsurprisingly, again, in a warming world, sea ice is being lost, is shrinking. We've got rising temperatures globally, particularly in high latitude areas like the Arctic. So we're seeing a decline in sea ice there. We're seeing habitat loss, so the seals and the polar bears that we all know and love and that rely on the sea ice for getting about and finding food are being detrimentally affected by the loss of sea ice. We're also seeing something of a feedback loop here. Okay, so one of the important functions of sea ice is that it's white and it reflects solar energy back into space. So by losing sea ice, we are making the poles essentially darker. And as you all know, if you've ever stepped outside on a hot day in a black t-shirt, darker things warm up a lot quicker than lighter things. And as a result, the poles are sort of becoming warmer and warmer the more the sea ice is lost. Storms. So obviously, warm water holds more energy and it provides more energy for storm formation. Warm air equally holds more moisture. Okay, so precipitation events are becoming so more catastrophic precipitation events are becoming more frequent and becoming more intense as well. So storminess is increasing. In terms of the biosphere, migration. So fish, again, like coral reefs, they have quite specific ecological tolerances. So they're quite sensitive to things like temperature, for example. So as certain species are experiencing warming waters, they're moving, they're migrating to try and find cooler waters. That affects the ecosystems where they're leaving and where they're arriving, and it also affects the sort of communities that rely on those fish stocks and things like that for their own food and their own sort of economic viability. And last but not least, we've got ocean acidification. Apologise, this slide is a menu of bad news in many ways, but we'll come on to some more hopeful stuff in a second. Ocean acidification. So as more CO2 gets into the world's oceans, it turns the water ever so slightly acidic, and that makes it harder for things like shellfish or corals or certain phytoplankton to actually build their shells, their structures, their skeletons. So this sort of primary producer, this bottom of the food chain suite of animals is being affected by ocean acidification, and it's causing sort of fundamental disruption to the building blocks of life in the oceans.
Tom, that I mean, as you say, a bit of a catalogue of doom. We'll come on to some more hopeful messaging in just a while. But these are quite, just to know what's happening in the ocean and just to take some time as classes to reflect on that, in groups, talk about it. Your teacher may have some handouts. You can see what that looks like on screen. We can also go back to the previous slide while you're working in classes, so you've got that prompt on screen for a bit. But what would be great is just there's no right or wrong answer here, but just reflect and connect to these and just share so maybe what feels most important to you. And again, there's not sort of like a hierarchy of what's the biggest issue, but just to reflect on that in groups. And we're going to put aside 4 minutes to do this, give you some proper time to have a meaningful chat in class or wherever you are, with a colleague, with yourself if you're watching on your own, and just take that time, and we'll use the answers you put into the poll. We'll get that up shortly, just to have a chat, and Tom to reflect on what people come back with.
Absolutely.
Brilliant. So we'll start now. Hi, Tom, and thank you, classes. I hope you've had great discussions, and you probably could have spoken for a lot longer, but sorry to cut that a bit short. Tom, we've got people coming back fairly uniformly with ocean acidification as the climate impact that feels most important to them, with the other ones not. How does that resonate with you?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a funny sort of way, all six of these impacts are important, and they're important in different ways and to different people in different places. I think a lot of ocean scientists would possibly agree that ocean acidification is certainly one of the bigger issues because, as we described before, these discussions, it has the potential to fundamentally alter the building blocks of life in the oceans by affecting, how are these shellfish, corals, phytoplankton, all of these different sort of components of the ocean system are able to survive. I guess if you lived in a low-lying Pacific island, you might put sea level rise as one of your most important elements here, important to you. Equally, if you lived near the Great Barrier Reef, you might put coral bleaching. I think the important thing is to state that in reality, all six of these effects are important in different ways.
Brilliant, Tom. Now we're moving on from the gloom and doom, and we're looking at how the ocean can help. And I know we've got just a sort of 4 or 5 minutes to work through this section before getting on to the all important sort of Q and A's. I know you've taken time in classes to send those in. Tom, we've got the slide up on screen. Two terms, one of which may be familiar as a concept to classes, but can you just take us through what's going on here? What is nature based and decarbonisation?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jamie. So I think we'll start with decarbonisation because this is probably the one that most people are the most familiar with, if you like. So there are many different potential sort of mitigation and adaptation strategies. These are probably two of the most discussed. Decarbonisation is, again, like I say, probably the one that most people are most familiar with. But I think it's important to consider it in different ways. So fundamentally, it's about reducing the amount of greenhouse gas that we as human beings emit, release into the Earth's atmosphere. Okay, primarily CO2, but also methane and things like that. Many people, I guess, think about this on an individual basis, though, and I think it's important to consider that it's not just something that we should be aiming to do as individuals. Okay, so the way that I often frame this when I'm teaching my university courses is that I talk about the four C's. So it's about consumers, so individuals, but it's also about communities, it's about countries, and also companies finding cleaner ways to live, to travel, and to make things, to sell things, to ship things around the world. So as consumers, as individuals, we can make small choices around what we buy, what we eat, what we use in our day-to-day lives, how we travel, how we get about, whether that's to work or to school, but also on holiday and things like that. When it comes to communities, we can think about how we can improve things like recycling programs or improve our public transport or provide greener spaces for us to enjoy. When it comes to that sort of country level scale, we can think about investing in renewable energies. We can think about our governments committing to clean, climate conscious policies. But also, it's important that we don't forget companies as well. So, corporations have a responsibility to reduce their carbon impact and their greenhouse gas emissions as well. So it's really a question about not just individuals doing their bit and maybe switching to a more plant-based diet or perhaps using their bike more than they use their car and those sorts of things. There are things that we can all do at various different levels of our society structures to really help decarbonize. Nature-based solutions. So this is much more in sort of my domain. So my background really is in ecology, both the terrestrial and more recently marine ecosystems as well. And one of the things that I've always observed in my studies and my research is that there are a whole host of ecosystems around the world that are absolutely fantastic at absorbing and storing carbon. Okay, so what we talk about in this context when we talk about nature-based solutions is helping those ecosystems by protecting them and by restoring them. We often think about how we do this on land. Okay, so obviously protecting forests, possibly replanting forests, replanting trees. We talk about more recently, and especially in the UK, we think about restoring and protecting peatlands. So the peatlands in the UK are one of the biggest carbon stores we have terrestrially. So there are all sorts of projects focused on restoring them and making sure they stay wet and they retain that functionality to be able to lock in huge amounts of carbon. But in the oceans, again, our minds really here turn to this concept, the blue carbon ecosystems, that's become a really popular idea and a really popular focus of research in sort of recent decades, and how we can best protect and restore ecosystems like mangroves, like seagrass meadows, like kelp forests, like salt marshes. Okay, all of these sort of coastal and shallow marine ecosystems that are so good at locking up carbon. But the other thing that we can also do is limit damage to these ecosystems and associated sediments on the continental shelves as well. So thinking about some of those damaging human processes that we undertake so readily, things like bottom trawling that can cause sediment that has been accumulating and locking up carbon for thousands of years. It can cause that sediment to become resuspended and potentially release the valuable carbon that it contains. So essentially, this idea of nature-based solutions to climate change is about helping nature keep doing what nature does best, which in one part, as well as providing biodiversity and other such wonderful things, is about capturing and storing carbon.
Brilliant, Tom. Tom, thanks so much. We've got a quick poll here, and just to look at some of the habitats you've talked about, we've got farmland, coral reef, mangroves, and rainforest. And just quickly, 30 seconds in your classes on your own. I want you to choose the habitat that stores the most carbon, and that's by area. So it's not in total, but by area. Which one is most effective? So we're just going to wait a little bit more. We've got one vote, two votes in. We've got mangroves currently in the lead with coral. I mean, it's a bit like a race course at the moment.
Yeah.
We've got coral reef and mangroves neck and neck, but mangroves slowly taking over. And I feel like we're into the final furlong. What's going on, Tom? Give us the answer.
Yeah, well, if mangroves are easing into the lead, they're spot on. Mangroves, it might surprise you, store more carbon per unit area than pretty much any other habitat on Earth. And part of the reason they do this is because they not only store carbon in their root complexes, which sit above the water, and the trees, obviously, that are growing on top of that. They also store mud in the store carbon in the muds that sit below them. So they've got above ground carbon stores and below ground carbon stores, which is in some ways quite unusual. And that's the same for many other blue carbon ecosystems too.
And I mean, if you're near the coast, and we've got a map, if you're near the coast, you're near a blue carbon habitat, basically. Sorry. And we've got this map up showing the distribution across the world to find out which one is closest to you. I think, Tom, you can take us through a couple of highlights.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got our four key blue carbon ecosystems there. We've got mangroves that tend to sort of hug the tropical coastlines there. We've got salt marshes that we tend to find in sort of more cooler and temperate regions. Seagrass meadows will actually grow pretty much anywhere, provided that the conditions are shallow and sunny. And kelp forests, equally, they're the ones that are thriving up in sort of cold nutrient seas as well. So I think we've got a few sort of local shout outs to do. We've got people joining us from all over the world here. So if you're from the UK, your blue carbon ecosystem of choice is really the salt marsh and the kelp forests that are so prevalent around the UK and Canada. Similar, we've got salt marshes and kelp forests on both the Atlantic and the Pacific coasts. In India, we've got people joining us from India. We have mangroves there down in the tropics, and also seagrass meadows again on both coasts. We've got people joining us from Austria and from Poland. Sadly, for the Austrians there, you don't have a coastline, but we're not going to leave you out. You've got other systems that link you to the marine carbon cycle. So you've got the River Danube, for example, which takes carbon off the land and takes it out to sea. And that's one of those classic examples of how the terrestrial and the ocean carbon cycle can be linked as well. And then just to remind you then what we're looking at here, you can see this sort of thin ribbon of lighter blue on the map there, and that's that sort of continental shelf sea where these blue carbon ecosystems are meeting the processes associated with the wider ocean, and that's why they're such an important area for us to focus on in learning about the marine carbon cycle.
Tom, thanks so much. You've been absolutely brilliant. We're going to go straight to Q&A now. I know we've got just 5 minutes of the formal lesson left. If we go over by a few more minutes, Tom, I hope you've got.
That's fine. Yeah.
Do keep on putting your questions in. Use the thumbs up icon to upvote any questions you'd like to be sort of prioritized. But we'll go through them, Tom, sort of, in the order that they're being submitted.
Mm-hmm.
First question is sort of how have ocean temperatures changed in the last 10 years and what's that impact been on life in the ocean, basically?
Yeah, so I think the most recent estimates are that oceans have warmed by about 0.2 degrees in the past 10 years or so. It sounds like quite a small number, as a lot of these numbers do when we talk about temperature increases globally, but actually it all adds up, and it doesn't take a lot of temperature increase to have quite significant impacts. One of the other things that's happening more frequently and with more intensity is the occurrence of these sort of these ocean heat waves as well, which again, as we've already discussed, are having massive effects on a variety of different marine and coastal ecosystems.
Brilliant. Thanks. The next question is from BFC Cornwall. Are there any species in the oceans that will benefit from the change in ocean currents and ocean climate? Are there any winners?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. We often talk about the animals that are becoming more endangered or going extinct because of climate change, but we often don't think about the species that benefit. And in ocean environments, there are species that will benefit from climate change. Jellyfish, you've probably noticed, are enjoying the slightly warmer waters. We've had huge bursts of jellyfish around the world in various places. Warm water fish as well are in some instances, seeing their habitat expand. But it's always important to remember that although some of these species are enjoying themselves, that often comes at the cost of the demise of other species and habitats as well. Essentially, although we're seeing some species benefit and some species not benefit so much, we're seeing a fundamental restructure of our oceans and the habitats that they contain, which is something to be a little bit worried about.
Tom, there's a question here from KC1. Is there anything to be done, or are the oceans doomed?
Yeah, so I think this goes back to what we were talking about earlier. There's a lot of doom and gloom to be found in this discussion if you look for it. It's important that we don't get weighed down entirely by that. So the answer is no. Our oceans are not doomed, and I think it's really important, especially for young people who are joining us, to not feel at all that all hope is gone. There is absolutely hope left. Things, I admit, aren't looking particularly rosy right now, but there's still time to do something about it. And the last IPCC report, so the big semi-regular report on all the climate change knowledge in the world, made a point that it's not too late. There's time to do something about it. So what we really need to be thinking about doing is cutting emissions in all sorts of different creative ways, about protecting those crucial habitats. Okay, so thinking about nature-based solutions, and just giving ecosystems the time, the space, the support that they need to recover and start soaking up some of that carbon that we're emitting into the Earth's atmosphere.
Tom, thanks so much. There's a great question here, which I rather like, which is, what impact will climate change have upon seahorses?
Yeah, so I'm not a seahorse scientist, but I guess this is quite a useful question in many ways. So seahorses, as far as I'm aware, really like hanging out and building their lives in blue carbon ecosystems, like the ones we talked about: seagrass meadows, mangroves, coral reefs, kelp forest, that sort of stuff. So straight away, we know that some of those ecosystems are under threat. Okay, and as a result, the seahorses and the other marine life that inhabit them are also under threat. So by protecting and restoring those blue carbon ecosystems, we can help protect seahorses and other sort of cute and charismatic species. And I call them cute and charismatic because, as I said earlier, it's quite hard to get people excited about muddy ecosystems sometimes. So it doesn't hurt us at all if in our discussions of ocean mud, we're also able to talk about the home that's provided to seahorses. Okay, and people are naturally drawn to those charismatic species. So if we can get people excited about seahorses, we can get them excited about mud as well, and that's really important for us.
Tom, thank you very much. We've got a question here from St. Meg's, which is what can we do to protect the ocean from climate change?
Yeah, so I think again, the biggest thing that we need to do is limit our greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, that's the in all of these questions around what can we do about terrestrial ecosystem protection or marine ecosystem protection, or the answer nearly always comes back to reducing carbon emissions. But there are also other things that we can do more specifically with regards to the oceans. And again, it comes back to, I might be biased because it's what I work on, but it comes back to protecting those blue carbon ecosystems and those shallow marine ecosystems, restoring them where we're able to, and also just doing a lot more research into them to understand how they work and how they might perform, how they might react to climate change going forward as well.
Brilliant. Tom, just quickly, there's just a follow-up question, which is from Riverside in Canada. Is decarbonisation a new word for them, but it essentially refers probably to a lot of things they already know about?
Yeah, so decarbonisation, I guess we more commonly might talk about it as reducing your carbon footprint. Okay, and again, that can be done on an individual basis, but it can also be done at various different scales from communities, countries, corporations, as well as sort of individual people as well.
Brilliant. From St. Meg's, you've touched on this, which is which animals are at risk due to ocean warming and acidification. Is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, so there are sadly many animals that are becoming endangered or even going extinct because of climate change in the ocean. So globally speaking, so on land and in the ocean as well, rates of extinction are far above where they should be. So it's important to note that extinction is actually a natural part of life on Earth. It's not something that shouldn't happen. It absolutely should happen, but it shouldn't be happening at the rate that it currently is, and it's no different in the oceans. I think researchers now suggest that perhaps as many as 1 in 10 marine species are at risk. So that amounts to thousands of different species. So again, some of those are a big charismatic species like the sea turtle in your background there, Jamie, but penguins and Atlantic salmon and Pacific salmon, as well as sort of key habitats as well, like whole habitats like coral reefs are becoming increasingly at risk. And I think all of this is scary and upsetting, but I think what it should do is provide us with motivation and impetus to conserve our oceans and also keep them clean as well, because microplastic and macroplastic doesn't help matters either.
I think we've got time for three more questions. So do upvote as well. From St. Meg's, are there any natural causes for the world's temperature rising? So certainly we've looked at the carbon cycle sort of changing and more going into the atmosphere from fossil fuels, but other natural cycles driving it as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So my training actually is in the study of past climate change over timescales of thousands to millions of years originally. That's what I did my master's and my PhD in. And yeah, on sort of large scale terms and over long time scales, the Earth's climate has varied in the past, and that's often been linked to changes in Earth's orbit, which dictate how close we are to the sun, basically. And that's caused us to go through this sort of fluctuation between ice ages and warm periods in between. But on shorter timescales, yeah, there are natural forms of climate variability that are linked to sunspot cycles and volcanic eruptions, periods of increased volcanic eruptions and things like that. Yes, they have an effect. They always have. Climate on this planet has never been static over any timescale. But what is concerning now is the rate and the magnitude of the changes that we're seeing. Okay, and that is without question, unequivocally, we now are able to say unprecedented, and that can only be attributed to human activity.
Thank you, Tom. We're going into the last question is going into coral reefs. Is there a man-made approach to apply to rebuilding the coral reefs?
Yeah, absolutely. And I was teaching about this just the other day at Exeter University. I'm not a coral reef scientist, but there are some really exciting things that people in my department are involved with as well. They're doing things like 3D printing coral reef structures and replanting corals and all those sorts of things to try and combat the effects of bleaching events that have happened, with increased frequency recently. So again, it's another example of on paper, we should be worried about coral reefs. We should be concerned around these claims that they may well be the first ecosystem to be lost to climate change. But it doesn't mean that all hope is gone, because there are scientists all around the world who are working night and day to try and find solutions. And some of these solutions can be really creative, such as 3D printing brand new coral reefs.
Tom, thank you so much for answering all the questions, for sharing your wonderful knowledge and insights with the classes and those participants in the virtual Ocean Pavilion. It's been wonderful. Thank you to everybody who's been watching for your great discussions in class and for the questions you sent through. It's been great. Do keep on studying these incredibly important topics. And do know that we, as Tom said, are not doomed. There is a lot of great, interesting, but probably quite hard work to do in tackling climate change. So it's goodbye from us. Bye-bye.